Chilean police cracked down on a day of protest against the government of Sebastián Piñera. We're on the scene. The devastation in the Bahamas. Mia Mottley and other CARICOM leaders arrived to assess the damage and the needs. And after former FARC leaders take up arms again, we ask when next for Colombia's peace process. Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. We begin in Chile, where the police have used water cannons and tear gas to try to block a day of protest against the government of Sebastián Piñera. More than 60 organizations came together under the slogan, "We've had enough, we unite," to demand an end to corruption in state institutions. The Chilean police used force to prevent the protest and detained some of the leaders. The movements are also demanding respect for a variety of basic rights, including the right to housing, water and environmental protection, as well as the rights of women, indigenous people and immigrants.
They arrested people, they shot tear gas at them, they blocked the sidewalks, they didn't even allow people to use the sidewalks. I blame Piñera and I blame Chauvin for this. It seems they are trying to bring back the times of the dictatorship during the 70s and the 80s. That's what they want. They want to bring back the times when citizens had known even the right to raise their voices. What they're doing right now is absurd and excessive.
I think we have to demonstrate as much as we can. This is all about resistance. Those who remain will get through. And we will get through because we have leaders from the other side that are also injured.
Our correspondent was with the protesters in Santiago and sent us this report.
They never managed to begin the demonstration. The police took up positions in all four corners of this intersection at Plaza Italia in the center of the Chilean capital. And as you can see behind me, they've started spraying the protesters with water cannons, and they've stopped them from gathering together. You can see groups of protesters on different sides of the square. There seems to be some arrests being made. So let's go and have a look. So you can see how the police have made it impossible for the protesters to begin their march, and they've arrested several of the leaders. We're just greeting one of the leaders now. Well, you see the police water cannons positioned here, and the demonstrators are beginning to withdraw to other points where demonstrations are also planned, even if they can only march on the sidewalk, which the police are also trying to prevent.
Our correspondent Paula Dragne got a report. A CARICOM team is in hurricane-ravaged Bahamas, where they are holding talks with the Prime Minister to determine what aid CARICOM can offer in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. The delegation is also there to get a first-hand look at the situation in the CARICOM state. Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley was among the visiting team, which also includes CARICOM Secretary General Ambassador Erwin LaRocque, Chairman and St. Lucia's Prime Minister Alan Chasney, along with the Caribbean Development Bank President. CARICOM has expressed its full solidarity with the government and people of the Bahamas. It says it stands ready to give whatever assistance is required to deal with the effects of the hurricane. Bahamas' Prime Minister Hubert Minnis on Wednesday evening provided an update on the situation on the island in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. He confirmed that the death toll has climbed to 20.
I just returned from an initial air assessment flight on Grand Bahama, which was conducted on a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter. Much of Grand Bahama was previously underwater, but Grand Bahama is now cleared. Some homes, businesses, and other buildings and infrastructure were badly damaged. There are a significant number of people in shelters. When one review from the east, coming central, Sweetings Key and the eastern area had suffered quite a bit of damage to homes. Many were destroyed, roofs were disturbed. But what was most significant Those homes that were built on stilts were not damaged. As we moved into the Freeport area, I can report that the flooding had receded and most homes in Grand Bahama appeared to have received minor damage. Freeport infrastructurally had done well.
Meanwhile, outbreaks of looting on Abaco Islands are adding to the misery of Bahamians devastated by the storm. The Prime Minister addressed this concern as he sounded a stern warning to looters.
Bahamians are distressed that anyone would loot and further the suffering of those affected by this tragedy. This is a terrible disregard for the safety and security of others. Be warned. We will prosecute looters and other lawbreakers to the full extent of the law. We are a country of law. Additional police and defense force officers have already been deployed. More security personnel were transported to Abaco today. There are approximately 60 Royal Bahamas Police Force officers permanently stationed in Abaco.
And relief supplies have started to arrive to the capital of the Bahamas, Nassau, as the United Nations said at least 70,000 people are in immediate need of humanitarian aid. Food may be required for over 14,000 people in the Abaco Islands and for more than 45,000 in Grand Bahama. At least 80 people have been rescued and evacuated from the Abacos this Thursday. The Prime Minister of Belize says the Caribbean needs to be climate resilient now more than ever. Prime Minister Dean Barrow made the announcement as he offered financial and other assistance to the Bahamas following the devastating destruction caused by Hurricane Dorian. He also sent a letter to the Bahamian Prime Minister offering condolences for the lives lost. A government statement said Belize will contribute US $100,000 to the Bahamas as well as Defense Force officers to assist with relief efforts. Meanwhile, Belize Electricity Limited stands ready to assist with restoration works. Trinidad and Tobago has also pledged to assist the Bahamas. The Twin Island state will contribute US $500,000 toward their hurricane relief. The disclosure was made by Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley, who adds that 100 Defense Force officers as well as 7 technicians from the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission will be sent to the hurricane-ravaged islands.
So we will support our crew from TNTEC, and we'll support our 100 persons from the Defense Force in the Bahamas, working with the JDF and under the direction of the government of Bahamas. Additionally, the Cabinet has agreed to make available to the government of Bahamas $500,000 US to pay for some of the expenses that they will have to pay for now, not the least of which is medical supplies. So those are 3 things that we are offering immediately.
Floodwater is reported to be rising on the streets of Charleston in South Carolina as Hurricane Dorian moves up the United States coast. Officials have reported more than 7 inches of rain in parts of Charleston as the Category 2 storm passes offshore. The National Weather Service has warned that life-threatening winds are possible on much of the coast of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. In other news, the Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez says that a criminal network led by the opposition figure Juan Guaido intends to renounce Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo region, which is in dispute with Guyana. Rodriguez revealed a conversation between an advisor to Guaido, Manuel Avendaño, and Vanessa Newman, who is linked to the U.S. State Department.
President Nicolas Maduro has asked that the prosecutor's office open an exhaustive investigation into all these crimes that are being committed and which are in violation of international law and all the international agreements that exist to combat transnational crime. But the most important thing for us has to do with the issue of the Essequibo, where there is national agreement that Venezuela defends and will continue to defend its historic and legitimate right to the Essequibo territory.
When we come back, a probe into Mexican officials. President AMLO has ordered an investigation. Details after the break. Welcome back. Former FARC chief peace negotiator Ivan Marquez has announced the creation of a political movement, just a week after he said he was taking up arms again. Marquez, who was also second in command of the FARC guerrilla group, said in a YouTube video that members of the new movement will have a mission in the social sector where they live, work or study, without their political affiliation being revealed. This comes after Marquez and two other dissident FARC leaders announced last week a return to arms, accusing the government of betraying the 2016 peace deal.
The Bolivarian movement for the new Colombia will continue gathering people in hiding by waving its white peace flags. Revoke the mandate of the politicians responsible for the current chaos and set a precedent to stop their impunity of committing atrocities and using their power against the entire nation.
The path to peace in Colombia has not been easy. Let's take a look back at how the process unfolded. In August 2012, the government and FARC started talks in Norway to pave the way to peace. The talks later moved to Havana, where in August 2016, the two sides announced they'd reached an agreement. That accord was signed on the 26th of September. In October, difficulties arose when the agreement was rejected in a referendum. On the 11th of November 2016, the government signed a new, very slightly modified peace agreement. A UN commission was appointed to oversee the disarmament and reintegration of former combatants. In August 2017, the FARC became a political party to contest elections. In October of 2018, the UN mission in Colombia pointed to a lack of results in the reintegration of former FARC fighters and the murder of social leaders that threatened the peace process. The 7th of July of 2019, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called again on Colombia's government to respect the peace accords after the UN mission confirmed the killing of 123 former combatants since the signing. The last chapter of this difficult path came last week when Luciano Marin alias Ivan Marquez announced that a dissident faction of the FARC was returning to the armed struggle. So for further insight into the situation with the peace process in Colombia, let's go live to Bogota and speak to Victor de Cuera Lugo. He is an expert on armed conflicts. Thank you so much, Victor, for joining us. My first question to you: many people in Colombia have said that the split among former FARC combatants, the FARC is good news for those who believed in war and not in peace. Who do you think will benefit?
Well, in general, we are in front of the peace process that unfortunately has not been implemented. And this lack of implementation depends on mainly the government, the authorities, the elites of Colombia. But even though that the government has not respected the agreement, we, on behalf of the civil society, we regret the decision taken by this part of the former guerrilla group to take the weapons again. We consider that we have to insist in the peace process despite the lack of will of the government to respect the agreement.
What is the military and political strength of the dissidents led by Ivan Marquez? How much real support do they have compared with the FARC political party, which remains committed to peace?
Well, in general, we have to admit that in every peace process, in an internal conflict, the creation of dissident is like normal, is like the rule, unfortunately. In the Colombian case, it's clear that how big is the dissident and how fast is the creation depend on the lack of implementation of the peace process. Most of the group of FARC took part in the peace process. And in this moment, let me clarify for the audience for a kind of dissidents. One is a group leading by Gentil Duarte, that is a group that never took part in the negotiation. A second is a group who really linked to the drugs dealers and was more a criminal gang rather than a political group. Another sector is the sector that announced the reincorporation in the armed struggle last week, that was a sector was taking part in the negotiation, and suddenly they decided to quit from the process. And the other is groups that has been in other criminal activities. We say dissidents, but there is different nature of the different groups. Now, the only one with political will or with political clear agenda, especially, is the last one, the organization who appeared the last week. But first of all, this is a formalization. The organization existed in the territories of Colombia months ago. And second one is marginal if you compare with the political influence of the former guerrilla group called FARC.
Since Ivan Duque assumed the presidency, more than 400 social leaders have been murdered. Who is doing this killing and why?
Well, one of the biggest problems in Colombia is that the second agreement, the agreement, we call the agreement in singular, but really is 5 different agreements. The first one is related to the agricultural issues. The second one, political participation, illegal cultivation, and integration of the FARC, the mobilization process. The second one is about political participation. And unfortunately, in this process, during this year, hundreds of leaders has been killed. Every single day, we receive information about threats or leaders wounded or the killing of our social leaders. Behind of this are the local and the regional economical and political powers. And the state, we accuse the state because just by omission, the state has not respected the obligation to protect the life of the leaders. Part of the failure of the implementation of the peace process is the lack of will to accept another voices, another political expression different from the political traditional parties. And who is the beneficiary of this killing of leaders is the political traditional parties and the elites. Because in this sense, killing the leaders, you are killing all the political opposition, you are killing the communal movements, you are killing the alternative political alternatives in the local level as well as the regional level.
Victor, my final question to you. Do you think it is possible to save the peace agreements?
Well, we need that. We need to save the peace process. I am particularly pessimistic because if you follow the Colombian history, the first peace process in the 50 years of the last century, we have done many peace processes with different guerrilla groups. What is the constant situation? The government of Colombia almost never respect the agreements. Anyway, despite of it, we need a peace. We need a peace. And in this way, more than the possibility to save, is that is a need for the Colombian society.
Thank you so much, Victor, for joining us. We were joined by Victor Cuerra Lugo. He is an expert in armed conflicts, and he was giving us insight on what is taking place in Colombia with regards to former FARC combatants rearming and also forming a political party. Shifting gears now, Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has ordered the Attorney General's office to investigate some public officials, including a judge, that allowed the freeing of one of the prime suspects in the forced disappearance of 43 students in Ayotzinapa.
From the National Palace, the Mexican president called upon the judiciary and the Attorney General's office to open an investigation into officials, including a federal judge, who allowed the release of one of the prime suspects in the forced disappearance of the 43 Ayotzinapa students.
It is something that requires further investigation in order to improve the credibility of the justice system.
The Undersecretary of Human Rights, Alejandro Encinas, stated that the sentence in favor of Gildardo López Astudillo El Gil, also known as the head of the Guerreros Unidos cartel, is a result of irregularities in the investigation of the previous administration.
We have to say it as it is. The wrong-named historic truth was built to the fabrication of evidence obtained through torture in order to benefit the perpetrators and against the victims' rights.
To make matters worse, this judge's decision, Samuel Ventura Ramos from Tamaulipas, sets a precedent for other suspects to be freed.
Unfortunately, this is not the only case. This will set a precedent for all those implicated in this case to be set free.
Since the forced disappearance of the 43 Ayotzinapa students on the 26th and 27th of September in 2014, 142 individuals were arrested, including 75 Iguala policemen. The rest were citizens part of the cartel led by El Gil.
The objective of Enrique Peña Nieto was to close the case, lying to us with his historic truth. He thought we would be okay with that, but no, we love our children too much.
This September will mark 5 years since the forced disappearance in Ayotzinapa. The students' parents have maintained their fight for truth and justice. They say they will continue fighting until justice is served.
It's official. The Sudanese Prime Minister has unveiled the first cabinet since former President Omar al-Bashir was ousted in April. Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok announced an 18-member cabinet, which includes 4 women, including the country's first ever female foreign and finance ministers. The announcement had been delayed for days as the Prime Minister mulled over the nominees proposed by social movement leaders. This is a major step in the country's transition to civilian rule after months of protests against Bashir and army generals who had taken over after him.
Today we begin a new era. If we did well in managing it, it will open the way to build a Sudan that we will be proud of. A Sudan that respects diversity. A good and democratic Sudan for everyone.
Pope Francis has urged the people of Mozambique to protect their hard-earned peace and aim to provide equal opportunities to avoid slipping back into civil war. The Pope was greeted by traditional dancers as he met with Mozambique's bishops. Earlier in the day, he addressed President Filipe Nyusi of the ruling Frelimo party and leaders of the Renamo opposition, where he said leaders need to discourage any form of fanaticism. Mozambique was engulfed in a 15-year-long civil war that lasted until 1992, but leaders only signed a permanent ceasefire last month.
Peace has made development possible in Mozambique in many areas. Progress in education and health is promising. I encourage you to continue working to strengthen the structures and institutions needed to ensure that no one feels abandoned, especially your youth, who make up the majority of the population.
South Africa has temporarily closed its embassy in Nigeria following violence against South African businesses in reprisal for attacks on foreign-owned shops in Johannesburg. The diplomatic missions in the cities of Lagos and Abuja have been closed since Wednesday after receiving threats. Meanwhile, Nigeria has announced plans to evacuate its citizens from South Africa, where at least 7 persons were killed this week in attacks on foreigners. The Nigerian Foreign Ministry said commercial airline Air Peace had offered to send a flight to South Africa on Friday to bring back nationals who want to return free of charge. People in the Democratic Republic of Congo have also been protesting against the xenophobic attacks in South Africa. Protesters rallied at a South African embassy and at South African-owned shops in the DRC's second largest city, Lubumbashi. Here was an isolated attempt to stone some South African-owned shops, but the protests were generally less violent than those in other African countries like Nigeria and Zambia. Meanwhile, the South African president has vowed to tackle the xenophobic attacks as international outcry grows. Speaking in a televised address, Cyril Ramaphosa said there was no excuse for attacks on homes and businesses of foreign nationals. The South African president further called on security forces to ensure violence and looting is contained and reminded citizens of the vital role neighboring countries played in South Africa's struggle against apartheid. Violent attacks left at least 10 people killed during the last week.
As I speak to you, the debris of several days of violence and looting continues to litter many of the streets of our country. People have lost their lives and many have been injured. Families have been traumatized. Livelihoods have been destroyed. No amount of anger and frustration and grievance can justify such acts of wanton destruction and criminality. There can be no excuse for the attacks on the homes and businesses of foreign nationals, just as there can be no excuse whatsoever for xenophobia or any form of intolerance.
And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Doris Polo. Thank you for watching.